Greetings, friends, brothers, and sisters. It's good to be with you again. We're continuing our teaching in line with our sermon series on the future present, and we're going to be in First Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to be doing a big chunk today with a lot of different topics, actually, verses 17 through 40. But as you flip there and as you go to, I want to just first thank you for continuing to engage these. I hope these are beneficial for your walk if you're an MC leader to be preparing for your gathering, as well as for our brothers and sisters in Sierra Leone as you lead your churches. We are praying for you. We believe in you, and we're thankful that you are able to utilize these well. But I do ask something of you. If you could go ahead and like and subscribe to this. So like this video, hit the subscribe button. That will allow us, as we get more subscribers, to personalize this page a little bit more. Love for you to share this with your friends. Any of these teachings or our sermons that would be beneficial for their discipleship or hearing the gospel for the first time. So crack open your Bible. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And as a reminder, we have been in this series, and we're in the portion of First Corinthians where he's really trying to strengthen them, establish them in a new morality. This is specifically in regards to their body, their sexuality, and marriage, and the varying things around marriage. So up to this point in chapter 7 alone. Now, reminder, chapter 7, there's a little bit of a newness to what Paul is addressing. He's now responding to what's going on in their church and with a letter that has been previously sent to him. This still is a universal letter in that there are aspects of this that he wants to be given to the other churches in the world. But he's specifically addressing some issues that are situational in what's happening in the book of Corinth. So he is responding. So I want to remind you that this is like listening to a one-way phone conversation, but only hearing one end of it. I don't know if you've ever been somewhere, whether you're out or you're listening to somebody have a phone conversation and you're only hearing what they say, you're not hearing what they're listening to. That's what it's like to understand the letters, specifically situational letters like Corinthians, in that we don't know exactly what they asked. Now we can start to get a little bit of it because Paul does quote in the beginning of chapter 6. He quotes a little bit here around what they were saying, but it still makes it a little bit difficult. There's also another nuance that we're going to discover, and we started to see this in the last chapter, that there is both commands from the Lord and I'll call apostolic spiritual guidance in these passages. There are things, and it was specifically around divorce. Paul is very clear. This is from the Lord. This is not from me. But there's other situations that as a wise leader who's trustworthy, he says here in verse 25, that are tricky. I was literally just on the phone today with another church leader who's wrestling through some things, and he was asking about this situation and that situation and what I would do. And it's just messy. There is no one size fits all every single time this thing is the answer other than the gospel. But even the application of that is different in different contexts. And so this is, in my opinion, what in many ways what Paul is doing in this passage. He's giving his preference, but he's giving them guidance as what he called himself earlier, a father to them. Now, if he has other children, he may give them different advice based on their situation, because he does have the goal of the kingdom of God, the gospel, the future reality of what the world will be like. That is absolutely his picture. But if that's the goal, sometimes if you're on this side, you have to go a little bit the other way. And if you're on the other side of it, you have to turn a little bit that way. That's what Paul is doing in his letters as he's strengthening and establishing the church. And so there are universal aspects to what we're talking about. And in many ways, he is correcting, strengthening, establishing a specific church in the midst of this passage. So he has been talking about various things. He's been talking about the importance of the body. We talked about that a few weeks ago, how we are embodied souls. He was going against what he calls this, eschatological women specifically, who believed that they had fully reached the resurrection. So therefore, the body was no longer important. And Paul's saying, no, the body is still important. Our cravings and desires, especially as sexual beings, is still a valid aspect of this world. Okay. So he talks about marriage. He talks about the formerly married. We're going to start to see him now address all people, but he's also going to continue to address the engaged. There's some specific situational things on what it means to be called that he talks about for all people. And then he starts to speak towards specifically single people. And then he closes out with a closure about the engaged and all people again. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the passage. So we see in verse 17, it's a transition. Only let the person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which the Lord has called. So this word called is the Greek word kaleo, okay? They are called by God. And notice how he's saying this is his rule in all the churches. So what he's about to unpack is something that is a universal application that is going to be applied to their specific situation. So what is that universal thing? What is that he's saying wants all, and it's about where they're called and to remain where they are. And what he's about to do, he's about to give some different examples that will unpack each example and why that is significant. So first, was anyone at the time already circumcised? Okay, that's one type of calling. Well, let him not remove the marks of his circumcision. Okay, pause. What? Like I was under the assumption that circumcision was kind of a permanent thing. Well, come to find out, there was actually a surgical procedure that was taking place in Corinth for people that were that had the belief that, oh, there's no Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free, so I'm just going to therefore completely remove that sign of the covenant. And there was a surgical procedure to do that, and Paul was saying, no, like, don't seek to remove that. Likewise, was anyone at the time uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. So notice, neither circumcision nor circumcision counts for anything but keeping the commandments of the Lord. So remember, circumcision, it was a Jewish covenant sign. Now we have baptism. That's the sign of the covenant for us, that we have professed faith. For them, it was circumcision. And circumcision was directly linked as a covenant people to the commandments of God. You are a covenant member, therefore you follow the commands of God. And what he's saying here is being circumcised is not the cultural ethnic identity of what it means to keep the commandments of God. You're baptized. You have a new identity. You are saints, Corinthians, Christians watching. You are saints. Your circumcision or your cultural identity does not give you the covenant community. You are in covenant because of Jesus. And Paul says this in Galatians 3. It's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female in Christ Jesus. And he kind of unpacks that in this passage again. He just unpacks it a little bit more, but he uses that same framework. It's not about your cultural identity that allows you to keep your commandments. In essence, in all of these, what he's saying is, wherever you are, and he says it in verse 24, in whatever condition, let him remain with God. In essence, it's saying you are able to follow Jesus in whichever way you have originally been. Are you Jew? You're able to follow Jesus that way. Were you uncircumcised? You're able to follow Jesus that way. You don't have to reverse or enact either of those to follow Jesus and obey the teachings of Jesus, as it says in the Great Commission. That's where he goes in verse 20. Each one should remain in the condition, whether it's uncircumcised or circumcised, in which he was called. You see that again there. So, cultural identity, circumcision, uncircumcised, Jew or Gentile, you are able to follow Jesus regardless of what state you were in. Goes on, gives another example in verses 21 through 24. Now he goes, the ESV says, were you a bondservant? That's another way to say that is slave. Were you a slave? And I'll use that language. When you were called, do not be concerned about it. But notice this little parenthetical statement, okay? But if you gain your freedom, avail yourself the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freed man in the Lord. So you may be a bondservant when you were in the Lord, but you're freed of the Lord, okay? Likewise, he who was free was called a bondservant of Christ. Notice how he flips that. If you're in the world and you're free, you're still a slave to Christ. You're a slave in the world. Don't forget you're free in Christ. The universal nature of our freedom and our servanthood, our slavery to Jesus is true. So remember, you were bought with the price. He says that in chapter 6, verse 20, when he says you were bought it with the price, obey God in your body. And then he says, do not become bondservants of men. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. If you were a slave, you being free is not necessary for you to follow Jesus. You're able to there. Now, here's the problem with this passage. The problem with how people have responded to this passage. They have taken this and said, see, slavery is not bad. Paul's saying if you're a slave, you can still follow Jesus, so we shouldn't stop that. Now, pause. A few things. Slavery, and this is why the ESV translated bondservant. It was very different than what we think about slavery in the slave trade of the 17th, 19th century in America specifically. However, okay, so some people want to go like, well, they're different, so we can't even say Paul's addressing that here. Some people had used this passage, especially in the slave trade, and say, see, Paul has an opportunity to condemn slavery, but he doesn't. So therefore, slavery must be all right. Rubbish. That's not what Paul's addressing here. You can't. Now, some people think that because, and this is true. There is slavery was deeply embedded in the economic and cultural system of first century Rome. Okay, some of it was indentured servanthood. Some of it was people were in debt and they went and they made themselves a slave to other people so that they could pay off their debt and then be freed again. There is nuance between the slavery in Paul's day and the slavery of our cultural heritage. The universal truth is that owning other people is not the way that God designed the world. That is not a part of God's kingdom. So Paul may not address that here because it was so deeply embedded that it would have been a opportunity for somebody, because remember, these are letters. Can you imagine if he had a letter and it got in the wrong hands? They hear what Paul is telling people. They would have said, this is worthy of murder. This is, worthy of death. And they would have put him to death. That's why some scholars believe that Paul did not specifically address it. He could have in person, but he chose not to in writing for that sake. We don't know. Okay. But I do want to draw your attention to this. Remember that statement in parentheses. But if you gain your freedom, avail yourself to the opportunity. If you get a chance to, do it. That's good. So it's not like if you're slave, you're destined to be there for the rest of your life. You could get free. And if you do, don't use what I'm about to say as a reason to stay. Like, that's a good thing. So What Paul's not saying is you must stay in the economic, where you are economically. He's not saying that. He's saying, no, if you're able to get free, if you're able to gain economic forward momentum, do so. Those are good things. But if wherever you are, that does not limit you to following Jesus. He can be with God in the midst of that state. So that's a universal principle that he now starts to apply to specific groups of people. Because now concerning the betrothed, this is literally the engaged. I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. This is called spiritual guidance in what I would say. So this is Paul's opinion. This is Paul saying in light of what's going on. Notice, he says, in view of the present distress. We'll get to that in a second. But the focus on this is not a command from the Lord, okay? There is something unique to this that we have to take into account as we exegete or interpret this passage. We can't automatically make the jump from Paul says this, therefore automatically we must. We have to understand what Paul was getting at. We have to do that hard work in order to understand how this may apply in our situation and how we may apply it to our discipleship. So verse 26, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. So remember, this remain is here. All of this, while it's universal, he's now linking it to the present distress. So here's the question. What is the present distress? What is going on that Paul is now giving them this? And this is where that one-way part of the conversation is really hard. There's multiple different ways people interpret this. First, they look at this term present and they interpret it as impending distress. It's not necessarily happening in this moment, but it's about to happen. Some people liken this to in two different ways. First, if you look at when Corinth was written, there was a looming famine that was about to happen. So they look at it as, hey, there is an economic food shortage, like dire thing coming to you. And so because there's a famine coming, I'm going to give you these instructions in light of a famine. That's one way people interpret this. The second way is that this is thinking about the return of Jesus. Those that advocate for this do two things. They notice how this word for distressed is used elsewhere. Matthew uses it in Jesus's language, but he also says, in verse here, the appointed time has grown very short. This language also, and then later on, the present form of the world is passing away. This is eschatological language. This is future coming. This is Jesus's return. The people think that Paul is interpreting this in like he has an urgency, a very high urgency that in his lifetime, Jesus is going to return. He is going to come back. It's imminent. It's about to happen at any time. So therefore, their responsibility is to prepare their life for that very thing to happen. Okay. That is what they were Paul was saying. But however, there is eschatological piece to this, okay? This is what I would say is more of a future present reality, though. Instead of him saying, this is about to happen, because we elsewhere, specifically in First Thessalonians, and what's happening in the church of Thessalonica is very centered around the second coming of Jesus. Some people had already been saying it's happened, so therefore, and so Paul's like saying, no. And so in there, he has to encourage them to continue working. Like, no, guys, it hasn't happened yet. Keep on keeping on. And in there, he's has this a different tone. It's not as urgent. Even in Second Timothy, when he's talking about this, there's a sense to which some people think that in Corinth, in his early ministry, he was very urgent about it. It's going to happen. It's going to be here. First Corinthians was probably one of his first letters. Like, Jesus is about to return. But as he gets older, there's a sense to which actually Paul, his urgency changes. Like, he's kind of come to the conclusion that it's not going to happen in his lifetime. So he needs to encourage. Now, there's nuance to that. I get that. Okay. Now, there is an eschatological, there is an end times part to this, but I don't think it's necessarily Jesus is about to return, so therefore I'm going to give you this. So it could be famine, that's present distress. It could be Jesus is about to return, and we have the words of Jesus. There's a lot of tribulation that's about to lead up to that. That's the second option. The third option is the present distress could be the universal nature of the suffering that was true of Christians at the time. I mean, they were persecuted, they were ridiculed, they ended up in the Colosseum, they were killed and murdered because of their belief system. So Paul could be thinking that's the present distress. I think it's partially the combination of for the first and the third, with a little bit of the second sprinkled in, because it is eschatological. But I don't think it's primarily Jesus is about to return. You need to think this way. I think that there's some present distress is the famine that's about to come, the practical needs and nature of what's about to happen. And this is why this is true in my rule for all the churches, in that there is persecution in the church. So you have to keep in mind this persecution, keep in mind this difficulty and pain and struggle as I give you what I'm about to give you. So with that said, we say, in light of those things, it's good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So what he's saying is, if you're single right now, in light of this distress, don't go about trying to change that. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed or an engaged woman marries, she has not sinned. So in light of this, like, I'm going to encourage you not to. But if you do, it's okay. It's not sinful. But notice, yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you of that. So in light of the present distress, you will have worldly troubles if you do this. I don't want you to have to deal with that. So notice what he says, this is what I mean. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live, and notice, this is like the emphasis of it. Let those who have wives live as if they had none, and those who mourn as if they were not mourning, and as those who rejoice, they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods. For those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings, for the present form of the world is passing away. He's saying, hey, in light of this present distress, in light of, I want you to think that Jesus is going to return. That's the second part. I do want you to think that. But in light of this famine that's about to happen, in light of the suffering that is just so prevalent in the churches, I want you to act as if those worldly troubles are not worldly troubles. Have an urgency, have an importance, because as if they are not there. Okay? That's what he's saying. He's not saying, let those who have wives live as though they had none, like go and sleep with whoever they want, because he just said before this to not do that. There's something else happening here. So that's what's happening here. 32. I want you to be free from anxieties. Notice worldly troubles, anxieties. And he starts to use that term anxious a couple times in this passage. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. The unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So what is he saying? In light of the present distress, and I'll actually say there's some universal nature to this. To be married is to have our attentions divided. Now, does Paul say that? I'm going to say this. Does Paul have a preference? Yes. He actually says it in, I think it was verse 9 of this passage. He does say, I wish that you were as I am. No, verse 7. I wish that all people were as I am, but each has his own gift from God. One person has this gift, another has that. Paul does have a personal preference towards singleness. Okay. But he does not want his preference to be a restraint upon them. Not everybody has that gift, he says. So he wants them to know, like, yeah, I prefer you to have singleness because you're able to have, your interests are not divided if you're single. I mean, think about this. Paul doesn't have a family. He doesn't have kids. He's able to, in any moment, at any time, follow the Lord and go. Now, for those of us that have families that are married, we don't have that much freedom. We have to take into account our children, our family. Is that bad? No, absolutely not. I mean, remember, Paul has Priscilla and Aquila that are team members with him. They're married. Paul in chapter 9 talks about the other apostles who are married and saying, should they be able to bring their wives? And Paul says, yes, they should be paid for this even. Okay. So Paul doesn't have a diminished view of marriage and a heightened view of singleness. What he's saying is he wants everybody to have an undivided attention to the Lord. That's why if you are, I want you to deal with those as if they had none. I want you to be fully devoted to following Jesus, whatever you are, whether you're a slave or free, whether you're male or female, whether you are circumcised or uncircumcised. The primary motivation is that they would follow Jesus with undivided devotion. That's what he wants here. For him, his preference would be for that to be in singleness, not in marriage, but he knows that not everybody has that call on their life. However, there are people that have that call, and I'll say this to my friends in Soma Federal Way, and you'll hear this in the sermon, that should be celebrated and heightened, especially, I mean, we start to ask the question, who are the second-class citizens? Are they the married or are they the unmarried? Specific times in history and specific tribes of Christianity has varied. The Catholic Church valued singleness so much and celibacy so much that they still require it of their priests, and they had a second-class citizen for those that were married. Oh, you can't handle your own worldly passions, but we desire the holy ones to be single. In Protestantism and in our tribe, I'll say, we have the exact opposite effect. We almost view singles as second-class citizens, as if there's something wrong with them that they're not married. Like, we play matchmaker. We try to get them married because there must be something wrong with them if they are single. And that's rubbish. That singleness is a gift given to some for the sake of the church and their devotion to the Lord. It's a difficult gift, just as marriage is a difficult gift, but it's still a gift. And what Paul is trying to get them to see is he wants them to have undivided devotion to the Lord. That's the goal. The guiding principle of this is that they would not have their hopes in their current states or in changing their current state, but that they would have undivided devotion to the Lord. Moving on, verse 36. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards the betrothed, remember this is engaged. So notice he already addressed them up here in verse 25. Now he's addressing them again. So if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry. It's not a sin. Okay. If they have passions that cannot be controlled, remember, we are embodied souls. We are sexual beings. There is a craving and desire that is good and godly for us. So if those are strong and they need to get married, remember, this is in light of the present distress, but this is what he's addressing them. Let it be so. But whoever's firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So in light of this present distress, you're engaged, you have desires, but you want to hold back on those desires. That's good. Hold off on getting married. You don't have to worry. That's one less anxiety or anxious thing that you have to deal with. So then, he who marries betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. This is where second-class citizens of marriage took place. But notice he's talking about the present distress. He's talking about how they can, in that moment, in light of suffering, in light of famine, in light of the desire for Jesus to return, that's what he's speaking into, that specific. And that's why he's giving this guidance. And notice, it's not a command. This is, no one's sinning here. This is Paul helping guide the church based on his godly, trustworthy preference. So, and then he closes it out. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Remember earlier in chapter 7, he was talking about what happens if you're married to somebody who's not saved. This is, now he's saying, hey, if you're going to get remarried, do it to somebody that's in the Lord. That's going to be really important for you. Yet in my judgment, personal preference, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think I too have the Spirit of God. So in light of all this, he's saying, hey, I have the Spirit too. You guys have your spirituals, but so do I. I'm trustworthy. I'm a father to you. I want to guide you well. I want to move you into things that are going to be good for you in light of this moment. And so in light of the present distress, Paul gives them specific guidance. We as disciple makers are going to experience things likewise. There are going to be times where we have to give guidance to somebody in light of what's going on in their lives. We should have the Spirit of God empowering, leading us, guiding us as we do that. It's very, very important. And so there are universal pieces to this passage. There are things that apply even if we are not in that distress. We may be in some distress. And there are aspects of singleness and marriage and sex. We talked about those last two last week, and this week in the sermon, we talk about singleness specifically. We'll focus a lot on verses 32 through 35, how those can be used, and those people that are called that way are a gift, are given a gift, and can be used for that. So I hope this blesses you. Grace and peace to you as you continue to walk in the future present. God bless.